Now, Lorcan McCabe, the Deputy President of the Irish Creamery and Milk Suppliers Association, Tig Buckley, Head of Agriculture at AIB, and Emma Dillon, Head of the National Farm Survey at Teagasc, have popped in to talk to us about farm finance. Lorcan, it's been a very, very difficult year for farmers. Can you tell us about some of the additional costs that they are currently facing as they look into winter?
Yeah, I suppose this all started really over a year ago, especially in the northern part of the country with the wet weather, and then it went on. And as this year progressed, even the people with the dry farms down the south, they've come under extreme pressure. Look, I've been talking to someone less than 5 minutes ago who spent 35,000 extra on a 100 cow herd, from buying silage the whole of March, then into buying extra concentrates and trying to rent more land to get more silage off it. So I suppose the southern part of the country is feeling it very, very tight. You know, there's even coming into the winter now, and you know, as an organisation, we'll be advising people to talk to their banks on time and get things in order, because there is severe cases with people with less than half their fodder out there, and they have to get in line and get their business sorted out financially, and as well as that, trying to source extra silage or concentrates or whatever. So we're hearing it in the office on a regular basis, you know, and as well as the finance end of things, there's a lot of people under extreme stress, you know, and they should talk to the Teagasc, whatever advisors they have, or even the farm organisations, talk to them. And, you know, they're not the only one that's in bother, we'd say, maybe even physically, mentally and financially. There's loads of other people in the same situation. So I think get talking to your advisor on how to organise the winter feed, number one. Talk to the banks in good time, and look, in general we find that they do talk to people, you know, if you make an effort at all, and talk to us, you know, if you need any other help, you know. So it has been an extremely difficult year.
On the dairy side as well, it's been going from a bumper year last year where there was very, very good incomes of up to 90,000, the average around 90,000, and we're looking at a shortage on that, a severe cutback on that for this year. But it's very unpredictable, as you say, and the weather scenario seems to be kind of centre stage to all this on the dairy side, and we can see that even in the box pop there. How many buffers do dairy farmers need? You know, looking ahead to the next year, you know, they need to be prepared for a number of weather events.
Yeah, I suppose, and I quoted on different medias last spring that all the organisations has to get together so we don't have these weather buffer situation. And in fairness, you know, the Minister and on the Interagency on Fodder Group did get together, and you know, the best advice has been offered, but who could predict that we have 3 events really in the 1 year? The other thing, you talk about the volatility, and our incomes is going to be cut by 50%, thereabouts. We'll be down to half of what we made last year, thereabouts. You know, and we have, ICMSA has put into the budget farm management deposit scheme, and you know, if that had to be enacted, we are pushing this for the last 6 years approximately, and if that had to be operated by government, a scheme whereby a farmer on a good year like last year can put away X amount of money, and it can be withdrawn on a bad year like this. You know, it's very hard for farmers to put money aside, because if you have money, spare money made the odd year, you're taxed at a high rate, and then you find you have nothing. So, you know, I think the ministers and finance and agriculture needs to push that on further, where at least there's a little bit of spare reserve that we can have a chance of dealing with these weather events. And even we've seen yesterday, you know, it's becoming more common that there's weather events, and not only that, the price of milk is very volatile. So we would pushing very actively to have some type of a deposit scheme that where you can put money away on a good year and take it out on a bad year. Now, we're not looking for any tax haven or anything like that, the strict conditions adhered to, you know, but something like that has to be done to take the volatility out of it. Because, you know, when you make 60,000 1 year, the next year down to 20 or 30, it's very, very difficult to deal with them situations.
Emma, you look after the National Farm Survey at Teagasc. Can you just reflect a bit on the average incomes that were achieved last year, and just offer some insight on the projections for 2018?
Okay, thanks, Claire. Yes, as Lorcan said, it's just been an incredible year, really. 2017, we saw record dairy farm incomes, the highest on record, about €86,000 on average. Obviously, this year has been really difficult in terms of fodder shortages, and we are predicting a halving of that income figure to between €40,000 and €50,000. So that's below the €52,000 in 2016. So I suppose what's driving that really is a large increase in feed use, so about 75% per dairy cow. And I suppose on the positive side, at least the milk price has held up relatively well due to lower global production. So I suppose that has been the one positive in all of this. In terms of margin, we're seeing perhaps a 60% reduction in that, all due really to those increases in terms of concentrate costs. We're also seeing other input costs increasing, so fertiliser, but really, and energy. But I suppose overall it's the increase in concentrate use that's driving that very dramatic fall in dairy farm income. For the other sectors, we're seeing relative stability on the dry stock side. So for 2017, we saw incomes of between 12 and 17,000 euro. We're expecting a net margin reduction of between 6 and 9% on those systems. Again, input cost increases, particularly around concentrates, is the driver there. Again, it's been a very difficult year for tillage farmers, and we're seeing yield expected to be reduced between 20 and 30%. So overall, we're expecting a farm income reduction of about 25% on those farms to about 30,000 euro. So as I say, it has been a very difficult year, and one that's been very difficult to preempt for lots of reasons, and particularly the very prolonged winter we had, poor grass growing conditions, and that increase in concentrate use. I suppose on a positive note, in terms of debt, farmers, we know from the National Farm Survey, 2/3 of farmers don't have any debt. And that's very system specific, with 2/3 of dairy farmers having debt of an average about 100,000 euro. So really we've seen a lot of the investment in recent years being driven by dairy expansion, and perhaps pessimism in the other sectors where they haven't seen a huge improvement in terms of margin, and for that reason not a huge amount of investment going on. But I suppose overall we'd have to say it's very context specific and very farm specific. We know there's regional differences. Even in 2017 we had very large cost differentials between the north and west and the southern and eastern and midland regions. So again, that will be a factor this year, with some farmers unfortunately suffering more than others.
Farm income reductions of up to 30,000 in 2018. Tyke, what advice can you offer to farmers who are trying to mitigate against that?
I suppose the first thing to say is, I think both panelists have already alluded to it. It's incredibly farm specific what has happened. So while on average there's been a substantial reduction, the level of impact it's had on different farms has been significantly varied. So if you take it, all farms were affected, which is kind of unique because of the fact that, as Larkin said, it started really last August probably. And so the first farms that were hit were the heavier farms, and maybe on the western seaboard as well, because obviously got very heavy rain. And then as the spring progressed, there was no grass growth on any farms, really heavy or dry, so they were all impacted kind of in the spring. And then as the summer has progressed, the drier farms have been more particularly hit. And then into cross sectors, dairy very heavily hit generally because of, I suppose, heavier stocked on average than dry stock farms. Dry stock farms hit as well. And then the tillage side of it affected, and also indirectly the pig sector has been heavily affected because of the fact that feed prices have increased significantly and prices have fallen there. So it's across the board. Farmers have been affected, but the variance between farms is significant. And so I suppose the point I would make on that then is that how you fix it or how you try and mitigate against it depends on your own particular circumstances. So there's a number of options that you can try and do. I suppose the first thing we would say is you may well need to try and get liquidity into your business, in terms of you need to get cash probably fairly quickly to allow you to clear out merchant credit or co-op credit bills, which are quite significant at the moment. So that could be in the form of getting increased working capital as a starting point, in the form of, might be an overdraft or possibly cheaper forms of finance like stocking loans. We have a stocking loan farm credit line, which is kind of what we would be suggesting to a lot of our customers to avail of, and it's priced at less than 4%. So it's quite cost effective from that aspect. So that's maybe the starting point. And from then whether that will be sufficient to get farmers through or not will depend on the impact it's had. It might be necessary to maybe restructure the cost over a 3 or a 5 year loan. Another thing that we have seen in some cases that in 2017 particularly, a lot of dairy farmers would have spent money maybe from cash flow on capital projects on the farm, maybe 20,000-30,000 euro projects, which they thought they would have been able to carry from cash flow because of last year was such a strong year. But now they're finding that the massive drop in incomes in a lot of cases, they're under pressure with cash flow. So we can retrospectively fund that now and put it onto a term loan at this point in time, and again put that cash back into the business. So I suppose what it is about is like, as I suppose as Larkin has said, it's about looking at your own business, talking to your bank as early as you can, and figuring out how do I best get through this short-term pinch point. And again, then because there's two aspects we've got to do. There's a lot of talk about how we're going to avoid this happening again, or try and avoid the worst effects of it, which is great, and we need to look at that. But the bottom line here is that for most guys, they need to get out of this one first.
Short term.
Yeah, and so that's probably the real focus. And when we can get through that, and this farming sector is an unbelievably resilient sector. We've come through a lot of difficulties in the past, and farmers are very good at coping with volatility. But it's difficult, and but to be fair, I think that most guys are at a point now where they're starting to engage with their banks, looking at how they're going to try and best amend or adjust their finances to get them through the period into 2019.
Just to bring you in on that point, Lorcan, on the engagement side, Tig points out that there are lots of options out there, that there is engagement, but based on the feedback you're getting from your members, how would you describe the levels of engagement between the farmers and the financial institutions?
Yeah, I suppose I'd say 80% plus, maybe 90% of farmers do engage actively and get on time, but there is always the 10% that unfortunately maybe for one reason or another they don't, and them is the 10% that should get out there rather than letting it go on, ignoring letters maybe, or ignoring the fact that they have to get more fodder in and more money in. And it's I suppose the 10% of farmers that's probably feels that they're the only ones really that has a problem, whereas there is more people has a problem. So I'd say then 10% of farmers should talk to the two people beside us here, Teagasc, to get the advice as to what best way to go about it, and the banks in our situation, or we find that most banks do cooperate as best they can. They don't want farmers to go to business. So, in general terms, if you're a reasonable person at all and come up with a reasonable plan, they will deal with you. So I would say, get in contact with the two organisations or three, us, Teagasc, or whoever the farm advisor is, and the banks, and get in there now before the situation gets worse. That's what we would find out. There's no question about it. What we hear now, the southern part of the country is hit the worst now, because there's farmers there has very little fodder, and they have to start working it out very soon.
Has it been also a bit of a wake-up call to some dairy farmers who had very ambitious plans on expansion, just how volatile it can be, how they are not ultimately in control? If a big weather event hits, it can knock them back, severely impact the outcome at the end of the year.
Oh, I think it definitely is. I definitely think, people maybe that expanded a little bit too fast, and I'm not knocking them, because, everyone wants to go on and maximise their profit, and indeed the country wants us to turn out as much milk and the revenue as possible. So I wouldn't be knocking them, but they have to take stock, and instead of possibly it's the little bit of difference in going from, if you're at 120 back to 110 or something like that, that can mean an awful lot of a difference. So I know young farmers and maybe people that extended it got hit twice this year, and maybe a little bit of rethinking could do, but I don't think farmers should cut way back on stock just because of we say a single year. There has been bad years before, and if we get out of it, you don't want to cut back on stock too much, or your income will be back. So it's a fine line, I suppose, and some farmers did maybe has a little bit too much stock, and possibly they should reevaluate it, and with the weather event. And I think from what over the last number of years, I suppose we've had good growth and mild winters. That even advisors now and wouldn't have had the same emphasis on having a buffer of a month's silage in stock, and most farmers need to have that. You need to have your normal winter plus a month or 6 weeks that will cover these events, because this last winter has been stretched on both sides. It has been an early start and a late finish. So I think farmers need to take stock of that and have that buffer.
Emma, finally, what advice are you giving to farmers at the moment who are, trying to sort themselves out and make sure that they have the best possible outcome they can by the end of the year?
Well, I think the advisory service have been very proactive in terms of fodder budgets and forward planning in that regard, and trying to, I suppose, match up farmers with availability of fodder. I suppose from our farm survey point of view, we can only go on last year's data. We won't have it until the end of the year, but we do know there are positives. 80% of farm debt is long-term, and so we know that most of that relates to land purchase and very little relates to working capital and machinery. So I suppose, there is that buffer there, and as Tyke said, there are, options now, where last year an awful lot of investment was financed internally. I think there will be issues this year around cash flow and merchant credit, and I suppose talk to the banks, talk to your advisor, and I suppose it's important to say, yes, there's volatility and we need to see resilience within the sector, but it really was a very unusual year, with a very difficult winter going on to a very long spring and then a really unusual summer. So I suppose as policymakers, we're trying to develop strategies to try and get farmers to spread the risk a little bit more around forward contracts, and some research by colleagues will be launched next week to discuss some of the options that are open there. And I think within the new CAP, there's a recognition of the need to deal with that volatility, whether that be around insurance or, as I said, some kind of forward selling mechanisms, which I know this year wouldn't have worked. This year was all down to the fodder issue, and I think certainly there's been lessons learned for the future in that regard.
Thank you very much for joining us. We're out of time. Now it's over to the Board B at 10:12.